Thanks, Dareth, and thanks everybody for showing up this evening. Um, so, as the introduction said, I have spent a lot of time studying bowhead whales. I've been lucky enough to spend time both in the fall in off Greenland, as well as northern Alaska, off Spitsbergen, and then almost every spring since 2006, I've had the great privilege to go up on the sea ice with my hydrophone and record bowhead whales, or, as happened this year, participate in a visual census of bowhead whales to get a population estimate to maintain a really important subsistence harvest of bowhead whales. So, to me, bowhead whales are really a whale of superlatives. They are the only baleen whale that lives in the Arctic. They live with the ice year-round. There's 4 populations that are recognized currently, and you can see those in this map. And each of these 4 populations have different population sizes currently. But what we know about all 4 is they were all hunted to commercial extinction starting as early as the 1600s, for instance, for the population here, which is the East Greenland, Svalbard, and Barents Sea. These animals, as recently as 15 years ago, were thought to number only in the tens after almost 300 years of not being exploited. We've got a population that occurs between Greenland and Canada. This population, too, appears to be recovering, like the whales I'll be talking about later, and there may be as many as 6,000 animals there, down from probably about 15,000. We know very little about the Okhotsk population. There are perhaps 200, 250 bowhead whales, and this is the only population for which we have very little information, and the only population where no one has put a satellite tag on a whale or made an acoustic recording. Some of our Ukrainian colleagues had been working there, but with the war have had to give up their research. And then finally, the largest, best managed, and probably healthiest population of bowhead whales is what's called the Western Arctic, or the BCB whales, the Bering, Chukchi, Beaufort. And they migrate between the Bering Sea, I'm sorry, this is upside down for those of us from the US, through the Chukchi Sea and into the Beaufort where they summer. So one of the many things that make bowhead whales superlative is they are ice adapted. There's only 3 cetaceans, well, 4 if you count gray whales, that occur regularly in the Arctic. 2 of them are odontocetes, so narwhals and belugas, and then there's the bowhead. And let's go ahead and throw in our gray whales, just because this is ACS, Southern California. And none of these animals have dorsal fins. And one of the reasons is because they have to navigate through heavy ice, and they interact with ice year-round. And bowhead whales, in fact, are capable of breaking through up to 1/2 meter or 1.5 feet of ice with their great big heads. You can see here this nice bowed head and bowed jaw that gives them their name. Another thing that bowhead whales are superlative about is they've got the thickest blubber of any large whale. Bowhead whale blubber, again, can be up to 1.5 feet thick. And of course, they use this to survive in icy waters. One of probably the coolest things about bowhead whales, well, the second coolest thing, I'll tell you what the first coolest thing is shortly, but I'm biased, is they're the longest lived mammal. Bowhead whales can live to be up to 200 years old. So it's conceivable that there are bowhead whales swimming around in the Arctic right now that were alive during the US Civil War. And we know this from lots of different information. We know it from indigenous knowledge. We know it from people finding ancient harpoon tips in bowhead whales. We know it from pulling out earplugs, and much like a tree lays down rings every year, large whales will actually lay down a layer of wax in their ear, and you can age them that way. We know it from looking at the chemistry of the eye lens. So there's many, many different ways that we've shown that bowhead whales live these incredibly long lifespans. Now, the coolest thing about bowheads, and again, I am biased, is that they sing. So of all of the great whales, only bowhead whales and humpback whales sing complex, ever-changing songs. They sing them in the winter. unlike humpback whales, bowhead whales constantly change their songs. We hear different songs from day to day, from week to week. And so far, we've never heard the same song between two different wintering seasons. And what I'd like to do, I was telling the organizers early that I could give a whole talk just about bowhead singing behavior, but I'm going to resist. But I will play you one bowhead song. And what you're looking at on the top is a spectrogram, which is a picture of sound with frequency unlabeled on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. And I have two spectrograms here that are just showing you two very different songs. And if I played them, you would hear that they're different, but clearly, even in looking at them, you can tell they're different. So I'll play part of this more complex, clearer song. Here's the gap. Okay, I'll stop it there because I could just sit and listen to that all day long. Another way that bowheads are superlative is, in addition to having the thickest blubber, they also have the longest baleen of any whale. You guys all know about baleen whales, so I'm not going to explain what baleen is, but here, for instance, is a skeleton that's in the University of Copenhagen that shows you the baleen hanging down from the roof of the bowhead whale mouth. Bowhead whale baleen can be over 4 meters long because bowheads are giant heads that plow through the water and eat teeny tiny little copepods. So the food they eat is essentially the size of a grain of rice. And so they need a tremendous amount of food to feed that big body. So the fact that they have thick blubber and the fact that they have really long baleen is actually what got bowhead whales in trouble. So their cousins, the right whales, were largely hunted out in the 15 and 1600s. But starting in the 15 and 1600s, Dutch whalers moved north into the ice in wooden boats to hunt bowhead whales. And they did this because of the baleen, which whalers would call whalebone. Of course, it's not bone. It's made of keratin like our hair and our fingernails. And they were incredibly successful because, like right whales, bowheads are relatively slow. They float when they're killed, and they yield tremendous amounts of blubber and baleen. So this is just an example of a shipyard in San Francisco. In the 1860s, San Francisco was actually considered the New Bedford of whaling, because after all the right whales had been wiped out, Yankee whalers went down around South America and up into the Arctic to hunt bowhead whales. And you can see on the top all of these barrels of whale oil, and on the bottom are drying bowhead whale baleen racks. And what's pretty interesting is in the United States in the mid-1800s, early 1800s to mid-1800s, whaling was driving the commerce. Okay, Yankee whale families were the ones who had all the money, and they sent ships throughout the world looking for sperm whales, looking for right whales, and looking for bowhead whales. And of course, we know that the oil from bowhead whales was used for lighting, lubrication, soap, and even margarine. And baleen, which was the plastic of the 1800s, because it was really flexible, it was durable, it was used for buggy whips, eyeglasses, umbrellas, and my favorite, corsets, because ladies, who doesn't want to have an hourglass figure? So despite going into the Arctic, despite taking these wooden ships into the ice, and often the ships would be crushed and lost, these whalers were incredibly efficient. So what you're looking at on the left is basically the harvest of bowhead whales. And again, this population that we thought initially was the biggest between East Greenland and Svalbard and over to the far northern Atlantic was really brought down to commercial extinction by the mid 1700s. So think about that. That was effectively 300 years ago. And even to this day, we think there may only be a few hundred of these animals left. And you can notice that, of course, the whales that I'll be talking about mostly, the Bering, Chukchi, Beaufort, they were really started to be harvested in the mid 1800s. And just as an aside, and I mentioned earlier that the bowhead whale, baleen, and blubber drove the economy of New England, it meant that it also drove the economy of the US. So during the Civil War, the Confederacy had the brilliant idea to attempt to financially cripple the Union by sending a ship. They sent a skipper over to England. He bought a ship on the sly, sailed it into the Arctic, and took out over 35 Yankee whaling ships. What he didn't realize is it had taken him so long that by the time he got there, the war was over. And so there's a really interesting book called The Last Shot, because it's about the last shot in the US Civil War that was taken after the Civil War ended. And then when Captain Scammon got to Hawaii, after his very successful foray into the Arctic, he saw newspapers that said that the Civil War had ended months and months ago. And this was sort of the first fake news. He didn't actually believe it. So if you have time, I'd recommend that you look up this really interesting story about how important whaling was and how important bowhead whales were to the United States economy in the 1800s. So at some point, when you effectively deplete the world's ocean of large whales, or you bring them to commercial extinction, it becomes much more expensive. The cost of baleen goes up, the cost of whale oil goes up, everything costs more money. At the same time that essentially bowhead whales globally and sperm whales, right whales were already gone. This is well before the rorquals were taken. Oil was discovered on land. And so kerosene became more readily available and it became less expensive. And this is a hilarious, well, I find it hilarious, cartoon from Vanity Fair in 1861. I'm fairly certain these are sperm whales, but showing the whales having a grand ball in honor of the discovery of oil wells in Pennsylvania. So it was not lost on the public that the discovery of oil on land could potentially help save the whales. It's also not lost on our present public that that discovery of oil on land has potentially led to many changes in the environment. And I'll be talking about some of those later that could potentially be putting large whales broadly in harm's way again. So the good news is, if you stop killing whales en masse and leave them alone, there's actually a really good chance that many of them will recover. And we've seen that in gray whales. We've seen that in populations of bowhead whales. We have certainly seen it in humpback whales. And it's also true for bowhead whales. So this is an outdated population size and trend for the Western Arctic, or the Bering, Chukchi, Beaufort bowhead whales, showing that they've increased from the late 1970s. And in this case, the star is based on data from 2011, up to over 18,000 whales. Again, we're required to have a population estimate almost every 10 years so that the Inupiaq and Yupik Eskimos of Alaska can maintain their quota. And just this spring was another census that was incredibly successful. Those of us who are out watching whales saw over 5,000 individuals. And you do this by standing on the ice and looking for whales. But there's also a passive acoustics component to this project, where an array of hydrophones is put out so that when it's dark, when it's foggy, when the lead, which is an opening between shore fast ice and sea ice, is closed, whales are still passing, and we know that. And the Inupiaq have been telling us that for decades. So the acoustic data, which was actually started by Dr. Chris Clark at Cornell, augments the visual data, which is really exciting. But of course, these data are incredibly difficult to get. Even when the Arctic is gorgeous, as in this photo, the sea ice is constantly changing. Even when the sky is blue, it can be really, really cold. And of course, there's always fog and ice and maybe some more fog. And I will say that of all the research that I've done globally, this is the only place where I've actually felt like I was back in the food chain. So it's not a simple thing to study Arctic marine mammals. And so what we've done is develop new tools, develop different tools. You know, off of Southern California, you can get on a boat, maybe you wear a lot of sunscreen, maybe even shorts, and you can see lots of animals. You can take their photos, you can get biopsies, you can put tags on them. In the Arctic, because there's ice, because there's polar night, because many of the villages we work out of are fairly remote, it can be quite difficult to get anything done and very, very expensive. Nevertheless, lots of really clever people have developed some great tools that have really helped us understand a lot more about many populations of bowheads. One of the most interesting and probably most successful is a long-term collaboration between the Alaska Department of Fish and Game's Arctic Marine Mammal Program, led by Laurie Quakenbush, and native hunters to put satellite tags on bowhead whales. And this is just one track from June to August showing how the whales change their patterns during different years and how individual whales can actually migrate through the Beaufort. This has also been done in Davis Strait, so between Greenland and Canada, as well as off of Spitsbergen. And each of these three populations of whales do very different things. They're all associated with ice. They all have migratory patterns, but for instance, the animals off of Spitsbergen actually seem to migrate south during the summer and north during the winter, whereas our Western Arctic bowhead whales spend the winter down in the Bering Sea, migrate through Bering Strait, this is Alaska, through the Chukchi Sea, and then you can see the heavy concentration of whales feeding in the Amundsen Gulf. We've also been able to use aerial surveys, and that can give you an idea of the distribution of animals and how that changes over time. There was a long-term project funded by the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management that was looking at aerial survey data for large whales starting in 1979. And because those data repeated the same transects over and over again, it provided almost 4 decades of data so that we could compare changes in bowhead whale distribution, but also, as I'll discuss a little bit later, changes in the presence of other species in the Arctic as the Arctic warms. And then probably one of the most fruitful and successful ways that those of us who study bowhead whales have been able to learn more about them is through a really deep collaboration with whaling captains. The whaling captains in all the villages are incredibly generous, allowing scientists to go and take samples of baleen in this case. And you can see this is Clarissa Teixeira, who is a PhD who is working on looking at stable isotopes in baleen. We can look at body condition. We can look at the overall health of bowhead whales. We can get, for instance, the earplugs of bowhead whales to look at stress hormones and aging. So without this collaboration and cooperation between native hunters and scientists, we would know very, very little about bowhead whales. And so it's truly a blessing that they allow us to learn from them. They share their data to learn more about these animals that they know so much about. And then, because of course I had to leave the best for last, we also use acoustics. So I use passive acoustics, which is simply listening using a hydrophone or an underwater microphone, whether from a dipping hydrophone setup in a ring seal hole, as you can see here, or from putting a hydrophone on a big oceanographic mooring over a year to listen to the soundscape and listen to how things change over time. And of course, one of the many advantages of acoustics is if you're in the Arctic, you can listen in polar night, you can listen under the ice. All marine animals produce sounds because really, while for most of us humans, sight is our primary modality, for bowhead whales, for all whales, for fish, and even invertebrates, sound is the way they find food, the way they navigate, the way they find mates. So because they are obligate sound producers, we can take advantage of that and eavesdrop on the Arctic and many other oceans. So I just want to talk very briefly about one of the ways that we've been able to use listening to bowhead whales to basically launch a whole other research project. And in 2008, which was an international polar year, 2008, 2009, colleagues and I had the good fortune to place a hydrophone, which is shown as this tiny green dot, right in the center of what used to be the core area for bowhead whale harvesting in 1600 and 1700. And we were interested in listening for these very rare Spitsbergen whales. And again, at the time, we thought there might be tens of whales left in the population. And so the idea was, can we put a hydrophone out and hopefully we'll hear a bowhead or maybe two. Well, when we got the data back, what we heard, and this blew my socks off, was nonstop singing 24 hours a day from late October into April. And this is when we first discovered that bowhead whales actually sing dozens of songs a year. And so this was incredibly exciting. And because it was so successful, we kept putting the hydrophones out year after year after year. And it turns out that this location, which was a hot spot in the 1600s for bowhead whales, remained a hot spot into the 2000s. And so because of that, colleagues of mine at the Norwegian Polar Institute have started a much bigger project where they go to this region with helicopters because it's still a lot of sea ice, and they're able to satellite tag whales, they're able to do aerial surveys to get population estimates, they're able to get biopsies to better understand the health of these whales. And so listening underwater has led to a lot more research. And at this point, instead of tens of bowhead whales in this population, we think there might be 300 to 500, which suggests that there's probably even more. Now, that's still a tiny, tiny proportion of the original population. Nevertheless, it suggests that this population might be slightly healthier than we thought. So I talked a little bit about change in the ecosystem, and clearly bowhead whales are at the forefront, and the Arctic is at the forefront. Right? The Arctic is warming 4 times as fast as the rest of the globe. And the best way to see that is in the decrease in seasonal sea ice. And you're looking here at the Arctic sea ice minimum that's changing over time. And overall, we've been losing 12.5% sea ice per decade. So it's pretty precipitous. And what I'm going to talk about really are the animals that occur here that have lost a tremendous amount of ice. So in fact, what we call the open water season, which is which is the season which is navigable to ships, has increased in some areas, like the Barents Sea, by up to 5 months. In the Chukchi Sea, it's on the order of 4 months. So where there used to be sea ice off of Barrow in October, and Barrow, also known as Utqiagvik, that's its new name, now there is no sea ice even in December. And those of you who are familiar with gray whales will remember the great gray whale rescue of 1988, when 3 gray whales got trapped in heavy ice right off of here. That was in October, when the sea ice was many, many feet thick. That just doesn't happen anymore. And so you might imagine with these radical changes in the ecosystem that we're going to have fairly large changes to the animals that live in the ecosystem. So not only is sea ice distribution changing, What we know now is that the distribution of bowhead whales is also changing. I mentioned the satellite tagging earlier, and one of the first really interesting indications of this was just serendipitously, a bowhead whale was tagged up off of Utqiagvik on May 24th in 2010. At the same time, a bowhead whale was tagged near Disco Island, completely different population, off of West Greenland in April 2010. If you look at the tracks of these whales, you'll find that effectively they met at the same place in time just north of Banks Island. And this suggests now that whereas bowhead whales, the individual populations used to be isolated from each other by really heavy ice, now there's the potential for animals moving between populations. And this is nothing that we ever would have known without the satellite telemetry. We also know by listening to bowhead whales that they're changing their distributions. So if you look at this probably too small little map, you're looking at the seasonal distribution of bowhead whales, and this is based on a map that Laurie Quakenbush developed. So in the winter, which is the brownish tan region, bowhead whales are in the northern Bering Sea. They migrate through the Chukchi, and then they spend generally the summer and fall in the Beaufort and Chukchi Seas. What Angela Szorka, who was a postdoc in my lab for a little while, did and found some really, really interesting data on is that bowhead whales are now spending more time, and some are even overwintering in the Chukchi Sea, not the Bering Sea. They're spending more time north, so they're spending more time in the green and blue areas than they are to the south. And thoughts there, she looked at sea ice concentration and found that when sea ice was relatively light in the northern Bering Sea and the Chukchi, bowhead whales tended to be heard more often north of Bering Strait. One of our thoughts is that this is due potentially to trying to stay with the ice and avoid predation from killer whales. Killer whales certainly occur in the Bering Sea in great numbers. They are occurring increasingly, as I'll tell you in a little bit, in the Chukchi and even Beaufort Sea. But it may be that because this area right here in the northern Bering Sea is an area that we think is used for mating and feeding and overwintering, females with calves in particular may want to stay north of Bering Strait to potentially avoid predation. So these are data that acoustic data have told us, but they actually match really nicely with, again, some of the satellite telemetry data from more recent years that have shown that the core use areas used by bowheads have shifted. And of course, without ice, ship traffic is also changing. So the Bering Strait, where we've got Alaska and Russia, it's the only passageway between the Pacific and the Arctic. It's only about 80 kilometers wide, but every ship that is going to go through the Northern Sea Route, which is in blue here along the top of Russia, or the Northwest Passage in red, or eventually the Transpolar Route, is going to have to go through Bering Strait. And it's going to potentially impact these bowhead whales that spend, the winter and early spring in this region. We know now that, in fact, some ships have gone through Bering Strait in the middle of January. They've often been escorted by icebreakers, but that does suggest that there's very little stopping large ships from going north. And the reason they do this, of course, is it's a lot shorter to go through the Northern Sea Route along the top of Russia than it is, for instance, to go all the way into the Indian Ocean, through the Suez Canal, and up. And some of you may remember, was it 3 years ago? A large container ship went side to in the Suez Canal and effectively blocked all sorts of cargo from getting into the Atlantic. Likewise, 2 years ago, the Panama Canal, due to climate change and a lack of water, didn't have enough water to let as many ships through the Panama Canal as wanted. So in addition to climate change decreasing sea ice and opening up more routes for shipping, it also suggests that climate change may be driving more ships through the Arctic because these other canals are no longer sufficient. So this is just a plot from 2009 to 2016, looking at unique ship visits in the Arctic. And of course, some of these are research vessels. Some of these are tourist ships. Some are fishing vessels. But quite a few of them are cargo ships. And you'll notice in particular that up north of Scandinavia, there's a tremendous amount of shipping. Just to orient you, here's Svalbard. So this is the population here of bowhead whales. Here's where that little green hydrophone was. Here's Greenland. You can see the Northwest Passage through here. And then, of course, all of the traffic through Bering Strait. And overall, from 2015 to 2020, transit cargo has increased dramatically. It has increased 2 orders of magnitude, and it will continue to increase. And here is just a zoom in of the Bering Strait region, again, looking at all of the ship traffic. And then if we compare the ship traffic to these kernel densities of bowhead whales, and again, these are data from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, the Alaska Marine Mammal Program, you can see that bowhead whale distribution has shifted over time. So for instance, overall from 2009 to 2016, in the winter, this is winter distribution, bowhead whales were really focused in the Anadir Gulf. St. Lawrence Island is kind of hidden here by the kernel density, but this is really bowhead whale habitat. In the winter of 2018, which was a really low sea ice year, bowhead whale distribution appeared to shift northwards. And then again in 2019, where things returned to our sort of new normal, bowhead whales shifted again. Now, these data are based on relatively few tagged bowhead whales, but overall, looking at the bulk of animals that have been tagged, it provides us some really interesting insight into regions, frankly, that we're not going to have access to due to geopolitical issues. And just last month, a report came out suggesting that in the next 10 years, ambient noise levels, largely due to lack of sea ice, due to increased wind on the water, because wind, of course, if there's no ice, it makes waves and that makes things noisy, as well as changes in shipping, could increase noise levels globally by up to 10 dB. So a doubling of noise is 3 dB. Noise levels are measured on a log scale. So if you go up 5 dB, that's like 4 times as loud. So bowhead whales, and of course all marine mammals, are incredibly acoustically sensitive. By increasing noise levels for animals that are generally, we could call them perhaps acoustically naive to a lot of these ship noise, we are definitely going to be decreasing their communication space. And this is research that's been shown in many other ocean basins, including the North Atlantic, where, for instance, North Atlantic right whales have found to have the area over which they can communicate be much, much smaller. So imagine if I'm talking to you guys and, I don't know, suddenly there's a giant thunderstorm, it makes it harder for you to hear me. So think about like a constant thunderstorm underwater. This is getting so happy, isn't it? And of course, we don't have just commercial shipping. There's also the potential for increased fishing and increased line entanglement. Work done by Craig George found that the probability that a bowhead has line entanglement scars does increase with age. A lot of the animals appear to be picking this up from ghost gear, and that's work that Dr. John Sitta did. But overall, the probability that a bowhead whale has been hit by a ship, unlike, for instance, right whales, is at present relatively rare. And I do feel like we're at a point, and like WWF and CAF, the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna, and the Coast Guard, and Pew Arctic are working on looking at shipping lanes, looking at the potential for slowing ships down so that we can reduce the possibility of ship strikes. So I've talked about sort of the human impacts of a changing Arctic. But with sea ice decline, we're also seeing changes in the biodiversity of the Arctic, from different zooplankton to different fish to different marine mammals. And of course, one of those that is causing some concern is the increased presence of killer whales in the Arctic. In the Sea of Okhotsk, and this is really the only data we have that's comparable, killer whales have been found to definitely change the behavior of bowhead whales to push them up into very shallow water. We know in the Canadian Arctic, killer whales have had negative impacts on both bowhead whales, belugas, and narwhals. And in fact, there's a whole book on the rise of a novel predator in the Arctic, which is the killer whale. Because of course, with that great big dorsal fin, navigating in heavy ice would be just about impossible. But with less ice, we are seeing and hearing many more killer whales in the Arctic. And this is a recording, if you can hear it, from the Beaufort Sea that was recorded on one of my hydrophones up here. And when we listen to killer whales or listen for killer whales, we're hearing them move north and stay further north as time goes by. So even up off of the Beaufort and even way up in the Chukchi Plateau, which is about 75 north, we've heard killer whales. And as far as we know, these are all transient types. So when we use acoustics to listen for them, we know that we are hearing an underestimate because they tend to be relatively quiet when they're hunting. So the killer whales are there, they're increasing, people are aware of them, and just last fall, hunters were heading out to hunt for bowhead whales in the fall, and they came across a big group of bowhead whales, or sorry, a big group of killer whales, and they just turned around and came back because they knew they weren't going to see any bowhead whales as long as the killer whales were out hunting. So we know elsewhere that killer whales have the potential to be a top-down ecosystem driver. And the question is, what will we see in the Arctic? Especially as sea ice declines. But of course, it's not just killer whales. We've also seen and heard minke whales and fin whales, and increasingly, humpback whales. I know, people love them. So in 2021, I was out in the fall with Craig George, and we were doing a net tow for krill, completely different project. And we saw a blow in the distance. And we thought, that doesn't look like a bowhead blow. So we pulled the net in and we headed the boat out towards the whale, and it was a humpback. And it was the first humpback I'd ever seen in the Beaufort after decades of spending at least 2 weeks to a month on the water in the fall. And Craig had never seen one either. And so we got back to land and we started talking to hunters and whalers and talking to local boaters. And it just led us to think, what is going on? Is this novel? Is this a one-off? Is it a lost animal? And so Craig and I sat down with Kayan Harcharik, who's a local guy, and we talked to Marie Carroll, and we talked to everybody we knew. And we pulled together all the sightings we had from shipboard surveys, from local hunters and whalers and boaters, from aerial surveys, and we put it all on a big old map. And up to then, humpback whales had only been seen in the Beaufort back in 2007, actually by Billy Adams, who's a whaler and a hunter, and they'd only seen once. When we looked at the aerial survey data comparing 2009 to 2019, and you're just looking at all the plots of the aerial survey data with tiny little symbols, but what you can see is the later years are the orange colors, and so that's really when we're seeing animals up around Utqiagvik. But in general, most of the humpback whales have been seen at this hot spot off of Point Hope. This is Point Hope, Alaska. And this is an area where almost anytime you go in the summer, you can see dozens of gray whales and many, many humpbacks. And in fact, 2 years ago, Sue Moore went through and she estimated that she saw 50 humpbacks at the Point Hope hotspot. So clearly, we are seeing more humpbacks in the area, and they are inching their way north. So prior to 2021, there'd only been 2 sightings. Since 2021, local observers have reported humpbacks at least 2 to 3 times a year. But then in 2024, so last year, I was out again, sadly, without my friend Craig, and we came across 2 days of these massive feeding aggregations of at least 25 to 30 humpback whales. No bowhead whales were seen. We saw a minke whale, a couple gray whales, heaps of birds, and this just seemed like a massive leap to me. And fortunately, I wasn't the chief scientist, but the chief scientist let us stop and actually spend some time getting pictures of humpback whales lifting up their flukes, just to see if we'd have any idea who they were. And here are just some of them. And thank goodness for happy whale, which I'm sure you guys are all familiar with. I'm only recently acquainted with it, but we uploaded these to happy whale, and Ted Cheeseman was right on it and made a surprising number of matches to Hawaii. So the question had been, when we first saw the humpback whale, we saw like 2 in 2021, like who were they? Where are they coming from? And this past year, because we were able to get so many more fluke shots, of all the animals that had been identified that had been matched to happy whale, they all matched to Hawaii. There are certainly some that are unknown to science, and also that were probably not good enough quality because I'm a terrible photographer, that we don't know. They could be from someplace else, but that was really quite interesting. And actually, a lot of the local folks in Utqiagvik were tickled by this information because many of them migrate to Hawaii for the winter too. So humpback whales have the potential to compete for space and food with bowhead whales. Certainly when we were out and saw the humpback whales, that was when we expected to see bowheads, and we expected to see them eating the krill that the humpbacks were sucking down. But as I said earlier, only humpbacks and bowheads sing complex songs and are able to imitate other sounds and are really flexible in terms of the sounds they make. And so, of course, now my concern is what happens, not if, but when they overlap in space and time and they both start singing. And in the Bering Strait region, we certainly see evidence of this. So what you're seeing here is just a plot of when we hear humpback calls versus song right off of St. Lawrence Island, which is the island just south of Bering Strait where bowhead whales overwinter. And then if we listen for bowhead whale song, you can see there is a time period where they do overlap. And this is a really interesting example that I came across from these data, where you see in this spectrogram, again, a picture of time, frequency on the y-axis and time on the x-axis, you have a singing humpback whale, but then if you can see these tiny little boxes that are outlined in blue, that's a singing bowhead whale in the background. So let's have a listen. So the woo is a bowhead. Woo. So I just found this really intriguing, and I keep expecting to hear more instances of this overlap further and further north as humpbacks are able to spend many more months up north and overlap with bowhead whales. And I don't know, I might be out of a job if I can no longer figure out the difference between the two. I mean, I can right now, but bowheads are such good mimics. They can mimic ice, they can mimic seals. Humpbacks too are incredibly plastic in their vocal behavior, that it's going to get pretty confusing, at least for the scientists, and who knows how confusing it might be for the whales. Yeah. So bowhead whales exist in a changing Arctic. Nevertheless, some of the populations appear to be really healthy because they've been really well managed, because they're also pretty flexible. And the hope is, and this might sound a little cheesy, that for those of us who care about the Arctic, who care about the planet, who care about the health of whales, and the people who rely on whales, because that's something really special about the Arctic. The Inupiaq and Yupik peoples and people in Canada and Greenland, for them, the bowhead is an incredibly important subsistence, cultural, and spiritual resource. And by sharing how special I think these whales are, my great hope is that other people will grow to love the Arctic, whether they ever get to visit it or not. And ideally, we can all pull together for a better future. And I just put in this picture of my two partners in crime, Billy Adams on the left and the late Craig George on the right. I've spent so many hours on the ice with these two guys. Billy, fortunately, is still with us, but we lost Craig almost 2 years ago in about a week. And I have learned so much from both of these men, and I hope to keep learning. And I hope today that you guys have learned a little something about the amazing bowhead whale. Thanks.